He was just a broke single dad in row 17 until the plane fell, and the CEO called his name. Jake Morrison counted the crumpled 20s in his wallet for the third time, barely enough for his daughter's asthma medication. Row 17, seat C. The worn rescue watch on his wrist caught the cabin light, a reminder of the life he used to have before everything fell apart. His 10-year-old daughter Lily slept against his shoulder, clutching her threadbare stuffed rabbit, oblivious to their financial reality. 3 years of fixing air conditioners instead of saving lives. 3 years of silence about what really happened that day. The plane shuddered violently, oxygen masks dropping like dead flowers. Through the chaos and screaming, a voice cut through the intercom from first class comm, desperate, unmistakable. "Is Jake Morrison on this flight? We need Jake Morrison up here, now." The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Jake's cramped Denver apartment. He'd made scrambled eggs with the last 3 eggs in the refrigerator, watching Lily eat slowly while her breathing wheezed slightly. The inhaler on the kitchen counter was nearly empty, another reminder of the doctor's appointment they couldn't afford to miss in Seattle. The specialist had been clear. Without proper treatment, Lily's condition would only worsen. Jake had sold his truck last month to pay for the plane tickets, and now they were down to their last few $100s. "Daddy, will the doctor make me better?" Lily had asked, her voice small and hopeful. Jake had knelt beside her chair, smoothing her blonde hair that reminded him so much of her mother's. Sarah had died when Lily was 3, a car accident on a rainy night while she was rushing home from her second job. Since then, it had been just the two of them against the world, and some days Jake felt like they were losing. "The doctor's going to help us figure out how to make you breathe easier, sweetheart," he'd said, not mentioning the $15,000 treatment plan they'd discussed over the phone. Jake had $300 to his name and a credit score that wouldn't qualify him for a library card, let alone a medical loan. Now, 35,000 feet above Colorado, Jake stared out the small airplane window at the mountains below. Lily had fallen asleep an hour into the flight, her small hands still clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd named Benny. Jake remembered buying that rabbit at a gas station when she was 5, right after he'd lost his job at Blackstone Rescue Corporation. It had cost him $8 he couldn't really afford, but the smile on Lily's face had made it worth every penny. The flight attendant walked by, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. Jake noticed how she avoided looking directly at passengers in the economy section, as if their struggles might be contagious. He'd seen that look before, the careful distance people maintained when they sensed desperation. 3 years ago, he'd worn a different uniform, commanded respect, had people look to him for answers. Now he was invisible, just another working-class father trying to scrape together enough money to keep his family afloat. His rescue watch caught the overhead light again, and Jake instinctively covered it with his sleeve. The watch had been a gift when he'd made team leader at Blackstone Rescue back when Richard Blackstone had shaken his hand and called him one of the finest rescue professionals in the business. That was before the equipment failures, before the investigation, before Jake's reputation had been destroyed to protect a company's bottom line. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was flying to Seattle using money from pawning his rescue girth, the same equipment that had once saved dozens of lives now converted into cash for his daughter's medical care. Jake had kept only the watch, unable to part with the last tangible reminder of who he used to be. Lily stirred in her sleep, and Jake adjusted the thin airline blanket around her shoulders. She'd been excited about flying, pressing her face to the window during takeoff and asking endless questions about how planes stayed in the air. Jake had answered patiently, remembering his own fascination with flight mechanics from his rescue training. He'd never told her about the helicopter crashes he'd responded to, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, the weight of responsibility that came with being someone people called when everything went wrong. A businessman in the seat ahead was talking loudly on his phone about quarterly earnings and market projections, oblivious to the sleeping child behind him. Jake felt the familiar surge of resentment toward people who never had to choose between groceries and medicine, who complained about minor inconveniences while others fought just to survive. He'd learned to keep those feelings buried, channeling his frustration into the physical work of fixing air conditioning units and furnaces. The work was honest, but it paid barely enough to cover rent and food, with nothing left over for emergencies or dreams. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Jake's hand instinctively moved to steady Lily. 3 years of fatherhood had taught him to be constantly alert, always ready to protect the most precious thing in his life. But some threats couldn't be fixed with quick reflexes or determination. Medical bills, overdue rent, The slow erosion of hope. These were enemies he couldn't fight with his hands. As the plane continued its steady progress westward, Jake closed his eyes and tried to imagine a future where Lily could run and play without struggling for breath, where he could provide for her without constantly worrying about money. The specialist in Seattle represented their best hope, but Jake knew that hope came with a price tag he couldn't meet. He'd figure something out, always did, but the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. The first sign of trouble was subtly slight change in the engine's rhythm that most passengers wouldn't notice. Jake's eyes opened immediately, his trained ear recognizing the irregularity. He'd spent enough time around aircraft during rescue operations to know when something wasn't right. The sound was wrong, just slightly off from the steady drone that had accompanied them for the past 2 hours. Lily shifted in her sleep, her breathing more labored than usual. Jake reached into his jacket pocket for her emergency inhaler, counting the remaining doses. 2 puffs left, maybe 3 if he was careful. The appointment in Seattle couldn't come soon enough. The plane lurched suddenly, not the gentle rise and fall of normal turbulence, but a sharp, unexpected drop that sent Jake's stomach into his throat. Several passengers gasped, and the businessman ahead finally ended his phone call. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but with an undertone that Jake recognized from his rescue days' controlled concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mechanical difficulties. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened while we work through this situation." Jake's rescue training kicked in automatically, his mind cataloging details while his body remained still. The engine noise was definitely wrong now, a grinding quality that suggested serious mechanical failure. He glanced toward the windows on the left side of the plane and saw something that made his blood run cold, a thin trail of smoke coming from the port engine. Lily woke up as the plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Her eyes were wide with fear, and Jake could see she was struggling to breathe. "Daddy, what's happening?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Just some bumpy air. The pilots know what they're doing." He helped her with the inhaler, watching as she took 2 careful puffs. That left them with maybe 1 dose remaining. The oxygen masks dropped with a sudden hiss, yellow plastic cups dangling like strange fruit from the ceiling. Around them, passengers were beginning to panic, their voices rising in fear and confusion. Jake moved with practiced efficiency, securing Lily's mask first before putting on his own. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing through scenarios, none of them good. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have lost power in our port engine and are experiencing additional mechanical issues. We will be making an emergency landing. Please listen carefully to the flight attendants and follow all instructions." The plane was descending now, too rapidly for a normal approach. Jake could feel the aircraft fighting against itself, the pilots struggling to maintain control with only 1 functioning engine. Through the window, he could see the Rocky Mountains growing larger, their snow-covered peaks beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "I want you to put your head down and hold on to Benny," Jake told Lily, his voice calm but firm. "Just like we practiced during the safety demonstration, remember?" She nodded, clutching the stuffed rabbit tighter. Jake wished he could spare her this fear, wished they were anywhere else in the world, but all he could do now was be the steady presence she needed. The plane banked sharply to the left, and Jake saw the pilot was trying to line up with what looked like a cleared area in the forest below. It wasn't an airport. There were no airports in this part of Colorado that could handle a commercial airliner. This would be a crash landing at best, and Jake's experience told him that survival would depend largely on luck and the skill of the flight crew. As the aircraft continued its rapid descent, Jake found himself thinking about the cruel irony of the situation. Here he was, a trained rescue professional, trapped as a passenger while his daughter faced the kind of emergency he'd spent years preparing to handle. But from the outside, looking in. Now he was on the inside, and all his training couldn't change the basic physics of a failing aircraft and a mountainous terrain that offered few options for a safe landing. The plane hit the treetops with a sound like thunder, branches scraping against metal as the pilots fought to keep the aircraft level. Jake wrapped his arms around Lily, using his body to shield her from whatever was coming next. "I love you, sweetheart," he whispered, not knowing if she could hear him over the noise of the crash. The impact when it came was everything Jake had feared and worse. The plane hit the ground hard, bounced once, then skidded through the forest with a grinding screech of metal against rock and earth. Jake felt his world turn upside down as the aircraft rolled, his seatbelt cutting into his chest while debris filled the air around them. Time seemed to stretch and compress. Simultaneous seconds felt like hours while the crash played out in slow motion. When the noise finally stopped, Jake's ears were ringing and his head throbbed, but he was conscious and apparently uninjured. "Lily?" he called out, his voice hoarse. She was crying but responsive, still clutching Benny with both arms. Blood trickled from a small cut on her forehead, but she seemed otherwise unharmed. Around them, the cabin was a scene of chaos. Some passengers were unconscious, others moaning in pain. The smell of jet fuel was strong, mixing with smoke and the scent of pine trees. Jake's rescue training took over completely now, suppressing his own fear and pain in favor of systematic assessment. They were alive, but they weren't safe yet. Fuel vapors meant fire risk, and in the mountains, rescue could be hours or even days away. "Can you move your arms and legs, sweetheart?" Jake asked Lily, running his hands gently over her arms and legs to check for obvious injuries. She nodded, still crying but trying to be brave. "Good girl. We're going to help some people and then we're going to get out of here, okay?" Jake unbuckled his seatbelt and immediately felt the wrongness in his left shoulder, probably separated but not broken. He could work with that. He helped Lily out of her seat, noting that she was breathing better than she had been during the flight. The shock and adrenaline might be masking her asthma symptoms, or the lower altitude was helping. Either way, he'd take whatever advantages he could get. The passenger across the aisle was unconscious but breathing, a middle-aged woman with a nasty gash on her scalp but no obvious broken bones. Behind them, an elderly man was awake but trapped by a shifted seat. Jake made mental notes as he moved through the cabin, his rescue training automatically categorizing injuries and priorities. "Is anyone a doctor or nurse?" Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd once taken for granted. A few passengers responded weakly, but no medical professionals identified themselves. That meant Jake would have to rely on his own first aid training and whatever supplies they could scrounge from the aircraft. He was helping the elderly man work his way free from the twisted seat when he heard a voice from the front of the cabin, weak but insistent. "Jake Morrison? Is Jake Morrison on this plane?" Jake froze. That voice was familiar, though he hadn't heard it in 3 years. Richard Blackstone, the man who had destroyed his career and reputation, was somewhere in the wreckage of first class, and apparently he remembered Jake's name. Jake's first instinct was to ignore the call, to continue helping the passengers around him and pretend he hadn't heard. But his rescue training wouldn't let him abandon someone who might be seriously injured, even if that someone was Richard Blackstone. He finished helping the elderly man to a more stable position, then made his way toward the front of the plane, stepping carefully over debris and broken seats. The first-class cabin was in worse shape than the economy section. The plane had hit nose first before skidding, and the impact had crumpled the forward bulkhead. Jake found Richard trapped beneath a fallen overhead compartment, his face pale and his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped through his expensive suit jacket, and his breathing was shallow but steady. "Jake," Richard said when he saw him, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you're here." "Don't move," Jake said automatically, his professional instincts overriding his personal feelings. "Your leg's broken, possibly your ribs too. Are you having trouble breathing?" Richard tried to shift position and winced in pain. I think something's wrong inside. It hurts when I breathe deep." He looked up at Jake with eyes that held none of the arrogance Jake remembered. "I know you have no reason to help me, but these people, they need someone who knows what they're doing." Jake looked around the first-class cabin. 2 passengers appeared to be unconscious. One was clearly deceased, and an older woman was conscious but bleeding heavily from a head wound. The flight attendant who had been working first class was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the crew?" "The flight attendant. I think she didn't make it." "The pilots." Richard's voice trailed off, and Jake understood. "They were on their own." "I need to check on my daughter first," Jake said, his tone professional but cold. "Then I'll see what I can do." He made his way back to Lily, who was sitting exactly where he'd left her, still clutching Benny and trying not to cry. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" "My head hurts, Daddy, and it's hard to breathe again." Jake examined the cut on her forehead more carefully. It was shallow, probably from flying debris, but head wounds always bled more than they should. Her breathing was definitely more labored now, and he realized they'd used the last of her inhaler during the emergency descent. Without her medication, Lily's asthma would only get worse, especially with the smoke and dust in the air. "I need you to stay right here with Mrs." Jake looked at the middle-aged woman he'd checked on earlier, who was now conscious and alert despite her head wound. Patterson, the woman supplied. Mary Patterson. I'm a retired teacher. I can watch her. Mrs. Patterson is going to keep you company while I help some of the other passengers, okay? Jake told Lily. I'll be right back. As he made his way through the cabin, Jake took a full inventory of the situation. They had perhaps 20 survivors out of what had been a full flight of 96 passengers. Several people had serious injuries that would require immediate attention if they were going to survive long enough for rescue teams to find them. The aircraft had come to rest in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, which would make them difficult to spot from the air. The smell of jet fuel was getting stronger, and Jake could see a thin wisp of smoke coming from somewhere near the wing. Fire was still a real possibility, which meant they needed to get the injured passengers away from the aircraft as soon as possible. But moving people with spinal injuries or internal bleeding could kill them just as surely as a fire. Jake found the plane's first aid kit behind the galley area, along with some emergency supplies. It wasn't much basic bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication, but it would have to do. He also located the aircraft's emergency beacon, which was supposed to transmit their location to rescue services. The device appeared to be functional, but in this terrain, it could be hours before help arrived. Jake. Richard's voice called out again as Jake passed the first-class section. Please, I need to talk to you. Jake stopped but didn't move closer. What is it? The woman over there, Mrs. Chen. She's not breathing right. I think she has a collapsed lung. Jake looked where Richard was pointing and saw an Asian woman in her 60s, conscious but clearly in respiratory distress. Her skin had a bluish tint, and she was struggling to breathe. Jake had seen similar injuries during rescue operations, blunt force trauma to the chest that caused internal bleeding or lung collapse. Without immediate medical intervention, she would die. I don't have the equipment to treat a collapsed lung, Jake said flatly. But you know how, don't you? You were the best rescue medic Blackstone ever had. That's why I called your name. These people need you, Jake. Whatever happened between us? Whatever happened between us? Jake's voice carried a dangerous edge. You destroyed my career. You let me take the blame for equipment failures that you knew about. 3 people died because your company cut corners on safety equipment, and you made sure I was the one who paid for it. Richard closed his eyes, and for a moment Jake thought he might have lost consciousness. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You're right. About all of it. The equipment was faulty, and I knew it. The board was pressuring me to cut costs, and I thought we could get through the quarter and then replace everything during the scheduled maintenance cycle. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke. Jake had suspected the truth for 3 years, but hearing Richard finally say it out loud brought back all the anger and betrayal he'd been carrying. And when people died, you needed someone to blame, someone expendable. The families were going to sue. The company would have gone under, and 600 people would have lost their jobs. I told myself I was protecting the greater good, but Richard met Jake's eyes. I was protecting myself. And I destroyed you to do it. Mrs. Chen made a gasping sound that drew Jake's attention back to the immediate crisis. Her breathing was getting worse, and her lips were turning blue. If he was going to save her, he had to act now. But the procedure she needed required tools he didn't have, and skills he hadn't used in 3 years. The galley has some supplies, Richard said, as if reading Jake's thoughts. Sharp knives, plastic tubing from the drink service. It's not proper medical equipment, but it might work, Jake finished. He looked at Mrs. Chen, then at Richard, then back toward the economy section where his daughter was waiting. Every instinct told him to take Lily and get as far away from this wreckage as possible. Find shelter, wait for rescue, let someone else deal with the moral complications. But Mrs. Chen was going to die if he didn't help her. And despite everything Richard had done to him, there were other people in this wreckage who had never hurt anyone, people who were counting on him to make the right choice. If I do this, Jake said slowly, if I try to save these people, it doesn't change anything between us. You ruined my life, and helping you now doesn't balance that scale. Richard nodded. I know, but maybe it's a start. Jake spent the next hour working with whatever supplies he could find, treating injuries that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. He managed to stabilize Mrs. Chen's breathing using a makeshift chest tube fashioned from a ballpoint pen and some plastic tubing, a procedure that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances but was their only option in the wilderness. He set bones using pieces of broken seat frames as splints, stopped bleeding with torn fabric and pressure, and organized the uninjured passengers to help move people away from the aircraft. All the while, he kept one eye on Lily, who was growing paler and breathing with increasing difficulty. "Daddy," she called out during a brief moment when he was nearby, "I don't feel good." Jake knelt beside her and listened to her breathing. Her airways were constricting, and without her inhaler, the condition would only worsen. He'd seen children die from severe asthma attacks, their airways closing completely despite every effort to save them. The thought of losing Lily here, in this remote wilderness, made his chest tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with their physical situation. "I know, sweetheart. We're going to get you some help soon." But Jake wasn't sure how. Even if rescue teams were already searching for them, it could be hours or even days before they were found. And Lily didn't have that kind of time. "Jake," Richard called out from where he was lying on a makeshift stretcher. "Come here for a minute." Jake reluctantly approached, his patience wearing thin. He'd done what he could for everyone, but his daughter needed him now. Richard reached into his jacket pocket with obvious difficulty and pulled out a small plastic inhaler. "I have asthma too," he said quietly. "This is albuterol, same as what Lily uses. It's not much, but—" Jake stared at the inhaler in disbelief. "You've had that this whole time?" "I wanted to give it to her earlier, but I needed to know. I needed to know you'd help these people first, that you'd be the man I remembered, not the man I turned you into." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Even in this desperate situation, Richard had been testing him, manipulating him. "You son of a—" "I know," Richard interrupted. "I know what that makes me. But I also know that if I'd given it to you immediately, you might have taken your daughter and left, and these people would have died." Jake grabbed the inhaler and hurried back to Lily, his hands shaking with rage and relief in equal measure. He helped her take several puffs, watching as her breathing gradually improved. The medicine wouldn't last long, but it might buy them enough time for rescue to arrive. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Jake heard the distant sound of helicopters. The emergency beacon had done its job, and help was finally coming. He gathered Lily in his arms and walked toward the edge of the clearing where the rescue teams would likely land, his mind churning with everything that had happened. The first helicopter touched down 20 minutes later, and Jake felt a familiar surge of pride as he watched the rescue team deploy with professional efficiency. These were his people, or they had been once. Men and women who risked their lives to save others, who made split-second decisions in impossible situations. "Sir, are you injured?" A young paramedic approached Jake and Lily, her voice calm and professional. "My daughter has asthma, and we're almost out of medication. She needs to be evacuated first." The paramedic nodded and began preparing Lily for transport. As they worked, Jake noticed the team leader approaching a tall man with graying hair who looked familiar. "Jake Morrison," the man said. "Tom Bradley, remember me? We worked that avalanche rescue in Vale 2 years before you left Blackstone." Jake nodded, surprised to be recognized. "Tom, good to see you." "Good to see you too. Heard you were the one who kept people alive until we got here. Impressive work with the makeshift medical procedures. Just did what needed to be done." Tom studied Jake's face for a moment. "You know, we could use someone with your experience back in the business. The new guys are good, but they don't have your instincts." Before Jake could respond, another paramedic approached. "We're ready to transport the critical patients. The man in first class is asking for you specifically." Jake looked toward the helicopter where Richard was being loaded on a stretcher. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Richard raised his hand in a small wave, part goodbye, part acknowledgement, part apology. "Take care of him," Jake told the paramedic. "He's got internal injuries, possible spleen rupture." As the helicopters lifted off into the darkening sky, Jake found himself alone in the clearing for the first time since the crash. The wreckage of the aircraft looked smaller now, less threatening. In a few hours, investigators would arrive to determine what had caused the mechanical failure. In a few days, there would be reports and interviews, and probably some kind of media attention. But right now, Jake was thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between justice and revenge, about the complicated nature of forgiveness. Richard Blackstone had destroyed his career and nearly cost him everything. But today, in this wilderness, they had saved lives together. That didn't erase the past, but it suggested that the future might hold possibilities Jake hadn't considered. 3 months later, Jake sat in his small Denver apartment, reading a letter that had arrived that morning. The envelope bore the letterhead of Blackstone Rescue Corporation, and inside was a job offer, not just any job, but the position of Chief Training Officer. with a salary that would allow him to provide properly for Lily and even put some money away for her college fund. There was also a personal note from Richard, written in careful handwriting that suggested his injuries were still healing. "I can't undo the past," the note read, "but I can try to build a better future. For what it's worth, you were always the best rescue professional I ever worked with. These new recruits need to learn from someone who understands that equipment is only as good as the person using it, and that the most important tool in any rescue is integrity." Jake set the letter aside and looked at Lily, who was sprawled on the living room floor doing homework, her breathing easy and unlabored thanks to the new medication regimen the Seattle specialist had prescribed. The treatment was expensive, but Richard had quietly arranged for his company's health insurance to cover Lily's medical expenses as part of an undisclosed settlement. "Daddy, what's that letter about?" Lily asked, looking up from her math homework. "It's a job offer, sweetheart. Someone wants me to go back to rescue work. The kind of work you used to do before you became a fix-it man." Jake smiled at her description of his current career. "Yes, that kind of work, but it would mean some changes. I'd have to travel sometimes, and there would be some risks." Lily considered this seriously, the way she considered all important questions. "Would you be helping people?" "Yes, I would." "Then I think you should do it. Mommy always said you were good at helping people." Jake looked at the rescue watch on his wrist, the one constant through all the changes of the past 3 years. For the first time since the crash, since the accusations and the shame and the long struggle to rebuild their lives, the watch felt like a promise instead of a burden. He picked up his phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. When Richard's assistant answered, Jake asked to be put through directly. "Richard, it's Jake Morrison. I've been thinking about your offer." There was a pause on the other end, and Jake could hear the hope in Richard's voice when he finally responded. "And? I'll take the job, but I have conditions. Full autonomy over training protocols, no interference from the board when it comes to safety decisions, and if I ever suspect equipment problems, we shut down operations immediately until everything's been checked and double-checked." "Done," Richard said immediately. "Anything else?" Jake looked at Lily, who was watching him with bright, curious eyes. "I want to establish a scholarship fund for children of rescue workers who've been injured or killed in the line of duty. There are too many kids out there whose parents sacrificed everything to help others. I think that's an excellent idea. We'll make it happen." As Jake hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, hope for the future. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to survive, but the confident hope of someone who had found his way back to purpose. The crash had brought him face to face with his past, but it had also shown him a path forward. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" Lily asked, sensing the change in his mood. Jake knelt beside her on the floor and pulled her into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be more than okay." Outside their apartment window, the Denver skyline stretched toward the mountains, and somewhere in those peaks, rescue teams were probably responding to emergencies, saving lives, making the kinds of split-second decisions that Jake knew better than anyone. Soon, he'd be training the next generation of those heroes, passing on everything he'd learned about courage and competence, and the weight of responsibility that came with being someone others counted on in their darkest moments. The rescue watch on his wrist caught the afternoon light, no longer a reminder of what he'd lost, but a symbol of what he'd found again, the knowledge that some things were worth the risk, that some people deserved a second chance, and that sometimes the longest journey was the one that brought you back to yourself.